Hello everyone. It's been a while since I've uploaded a video. I've been out working in Wyoming for a couple months and it's a very interesting trip. It's an interesting area both geographically and culturally, and I may indeed do videos about it at some point talking about it, although that's not what I'm going to do here. And I just recently got back, barely unpacked my stuff, and got the call to head back out to a very rural area in Montana, probably for a fairly long amount of time, although not as long as this last trip to Wyoming was. But it was very interesting. Whenever I go to work, even though I'm quite busy with work, I typically work a 12-hour shift every day. There's no weekends. For some reason, it really increases the amount of time that I'm able to read. And I plowed through more than a dozen books while I was out there. And I've kind of continued to do a sandwiching where I'll read a book on one topic and then switch to another and then go back to that same topic. So the main topic that I've been covering the most, and I've been doing this for a while now, is the antebellum period in United States history. Looking into the causes of the Civil War, the specific historical events that led to it, and that sort of thing. And then I'll sandwich those books with other books on anything from I read a book on the most recent election, on gyms, on other history, just to kind of keep my attention going. So in this video, I want to talk about slavery again. Now, I've made videos about slavery before, and because it's such an important topic, I feel fine making videos on it again. Slavery is such an important issue, but on top of it being important, it's almost always horribly simplified or misrepresented in the historical narrative that most people are familiar with. Now, that's something that I can't entirely correct at all, even if every one of my videos on this channel were dedicated to that. It's certainly not something that I can adequately address in just this one video. But there are a few specific elements in the narrative that most people accept that I think deserve to be reanalyzed. Okay, and so one of those is the role of the federal government in slavery. Because the Civil War has been seen and is seen as a validation of the federal government. It's a rejection of secession, of sectarianism, and it's also to show that, look, if we have social ills in this country, and it's very easy to argue and understandably argue that the greatest social ill, at least in the 19th century, was slavery. While the federal government abolished slavery, the federal government is this reforming, progressive in the more general sense of the term, force within our society, and that it should be revered for that sense. And if you go to Washington, D.C., something else that I've had the chance to do earlier this spring for another trip, the reverence for that period, and as personified by someone like Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial, is palpable. That government is legitimized by the Civil War, and I just think that this is a very, very simplistic and in certain respects completely mistaken idea. So the first thing to point out, I think now you have like the I don't want to say the alt-right, but like the people who do historical revisionism who kind of claim that, well, the Civil War wasn't about slavery. I think that that's, when you have a big event like that, it's going to be multi-causal, and there's going to be lots of elements to go into it, and so it is easy to find other motivations that people might have had. So you could look at the tariffs, or you could look at independence, or you could look at ideas about government and the division of powers, which is actually a fairly important notion among the secessionists. But you can't do those to the exclusion of slavery, because slavery was very, very, very important, personally, and in terms of why people, in terms of a motivation to secede. So, I mean, it's difficult to kind of construct a video on this because you could go anywhere with it, but I just want to highlight the ways in which the federal government actively supported slavery and made it actually possible. Now, this is not something that me as a libertarian in the 21st century am imputing onto the topic. This was the view of both abolitionists, and one of the books that I read is this, Means and Ends in American Abolitionism, Garrison and His Critics on the Strategy and Tactics. Very enlightening book. You read about the abolitionists all the time, and you don't necessarily read what they actually thought. Not that that's a comprehensive book, because people like Garrison published so much that it actually would be quite a task to go through all of his ideological leanings. But not only did the abolitionists view the federal government as a boon and a supporter of slavery, but many in the South and many of the Unionists in the South also thought that. You had people who were absolutely convinced that for slavery to function, there had to be a federal government over that was protecting it. And the reasons why are many. So let's go real quick, just start listing these. Some of these are going to be municipal government programs that help slavery, and others are going to be federal. The municipal ones are not so important when we talk about secession. They are important when people talk about, well, wouldn't you have slavery if you didn't have a government? No, you need a government to have slavery, at least slavery of the type that we had in the antebellum period in the United States. Slavery can exist in a stateless society. We have every stateless society that we know about probably has some form of slavery, but of the gang labor, big time plantation stuff, no, you do need an overarching coercive institution that's capable of subsidizing that by taking wealth from everyone, including non-slave owners, and using that as in a pool to help keep the lid on slave revolts. So on the one hand, you had in the South restrictions on manumission. Okay, now for those, manumission is something that in the long run can destroy slavery. Not on the theory that, especially racial slavery like we had in the United States. Manumission is maybe not such a big deal when you have no racial connection with slavery, but when you have a racist-based slavery, manumission is going to eventually weaken the institution. Here's why. If you have all blacks are slaves and all whites are not slaves, then the institution is much easier to control practically. If you see a black person walking down the street, you can assume that they're a slave, that they don't have rights. You can treat them accordingly. You can assume that they might be in a slave revolt. If, on the other hand, there are free blacks, this becomes much more difficult. You can't make that assumption. Escaped slaves or current slaves could much more easily pretend to be freemen and get away with a lot more than they otherwise could. It'd be easier for them to escape. And also, freemen, if there is a racial contingent, are the natural allies of the slaves. They're a potential political force, certainly at least an economic and social force, to help bring about the abolition of the practice. And so, contrary to the idea that slaves are merely private property that slave owners could then do with whatever they wanted, all the slave states put severe restrictions on how you could manumit, how many, and that sort of thing. And on top of that, they placed bans on freedmen from staying in the state, usually for a period of about 6 months. This was very specifically to prevent them from being developing communities of free blacks in the South who could then form a nucleus for political support, for slave rebellions, for making it slightly more difficult to identify slaves. So there's that. There was also an organized suppression of free speech in the sense that abolitionist anti-slavery literature was systematically suppressed in the post office. And this was very much done with the collusion of the federal government. This was done on the pretext that this was fermenting slave revolts, something that was a big fear. Haiti had a massive slave revolt that ultimately was successful. I believe the only successful slave revolt in history. And it was used as an excuse to then suppress abolitionists from sending material to the South. Now, the abolitionists could not mail anything to slaves. They were mailing abolitionist material to slave owners, slave masters. So clearly not something that could directly lead to any kind of mass revolt. But just to have that free flow of ideas was something that would be destructive to the institution. You had to have an ideological and a social framework in which it was justifiable. The Southerners were fairly well read. They were not ignorant of the world around them, and they understood that at that time slavery was becoming consistently less and less acceptable. It had become unacceptable in most of the Western world, and they were keenly aware of this. And several writers have commented, including several very pro-slavery Southern writers, that lamenting the fact that many Southerners seemed to think in the back of their minds that slavery was wrong. Now, there certainly were plenty of Southerners who did not think that, who were convinced that it was right. But that was based on quite an intricate uh, ideological framework that didn't stand up to a lot of scrutiny. You know, there's certain passages in the Bible that support slavery quite evidently, but then there are others that don't, and there's the whole thing with the slaves becoming Christians makes it much more difficult, and blah blah blah. So you can't allow a free exchange of ideas when you have such a thin ideological justification for what you're doing, and so free speech was suppressed. The manumission laws, the drafting of non-slave owners and slave owners as well into slave patrols, right? So even if you didn't own a slave and you were a poor white farmer who would probably be close to a subsistence level or maybe not that far above it, you would be obligated to help defend and support the suppression of the slaves and the maintenance of the property of your slave owners. Now this is a classic case of subsidized costs with privatized profit, something that we see many, many times. Something that could be attributed with causing the fall of Rome. Or you have the Romans conquer an area, they use the manpower and the taxes from the entire society, and then they award all of the benefits to that to a few aristocratic people, and then those people become phenomenally much more wealthy than they were before and much more powerful politically than they were before. And the political system that the Romans had developed did not function when you had a series of people who had acquired, that much more power relative to everyone else. You had something similar in the South. Everyone was forced to support it. Everyone was forced to pay for it. But beyond what was happening in the South, you had to have a large hinterland around slavery that, if it didn't practice slavery, at the very least would actively suppress would help subsidize suppressing slave revolts, right? So had there ever been a slave revolt, and there were several very minor, relatively speaking, incidents, nothing that called for that much, but if it ever had, New England and the upper Northwest would have been required and to subsidize the suppression of that. But more than that, you needed an area where slaves could not simply cross one river and be free. You needed a large area where they would be threatened with recapture and return to bondage. And this turns out to be an extremely important aspect of this that I think is sometimes underappreciated. It's not like if there wasn't a fugitive slave law that all the slaves would immediately escape and run off. What you would have had, though, is more of them would have been escaping. As soon as they crossed the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line or whatever else, if they could suddenly then be free, then escape is quite a bit easier than if you have to make it all the way to Canada. And that means that even though that doesn't mean all slaves will escape right away, that means that the chance that any given slave will escape within a certain year will increase, and that a slave will escape at some point in his lifetime increase that much more. And the thing is, the profitability of slavery was not that great. You had many years when the slave was young, when they were not earning anything, or when they were earning less than they were consuming, right? So obviously newborns and toddlers are probably not going to earn anything. They obviously would have put children to work, but the initial work they would have done still would not have been enough to earn their keep. And so it's not until their mid to late teens that you actually start getting money off of their labor. And then you have to keep doing that for several years to pay for the initial investment. And then you get to this point where their productivity falls. Some of them you're going to invest a lot in, and they're going to get injured and be unable to work as much anyway, right? They could die of other ailments or from injury. So for every slave that you get a full 40 years of good work or 30 years of good work out of, there are many, many more who you might only get 5 or 10 who wouldn't have actually paid for the cost of rearing them in the first place. And then even the ones who don't get injured or sick, they eventually retire. It was understood that being a good master meant that you had to sustain retired slaves. Again, they might do other things, other crafts, help the other slaves in some other capacity, but they're going to be a loss at that point. And so anything that increases, on average, most calculations put for a male that it wasn't until they were 27 that they would have probably become a net positive investment, right? So if you have a slave born, yes, he might start working when he's 13 or 14, and yes, he might become relatively productive when he's 17 or 18, but it's going to take until he's 27, because it's not like everything that's produced from 18 or 19 on is pure profit, because you still have to sustain the slave himself. So like the lion's share of what's produced is going to be just to keep him alive. Some of the surplus is going to be profit for you, but some of the surplus has to go and pay for the initial investment. And it wasn't until they were about 27, 28 that this became the case. Given that not all of them were going to live much longer after that, and the ones that they retired started eating into that a second time, not that profitable. And if the chances that he runs away when he's 27 or 28, or before then when he's 20 or 22, means you put all this investment in and he's gone. Now, granted, there was not a likelihood that this was going to happen to everyone. Certainly not. But if this just happened to 5 or 10% of your slaves over the course of their lifetime, that was enough to make this the economics of the institution not work, at least in the form that it was practiced in the antebellum period. Right? This is not to say that slavery wouldn't have persisted in some way or another, but to be as profitable as it was, to be as widespread as it was, to be as politically powerful as it was absolutely necessary that the northern states actively assist in catching and returning slaves. Not only in the sense that it would potentially give your slave back, right? He wouldn't manage to fully escape, he or she. You'd get them back, but that would be a deterrent from preventing a probably somewhat larger, potentially even a great deal larger population of slaves from attempting to escape. All right, so this was very, very important. And there were, what we had in the North then was this very interesting, slavery was considered wrong, even though racism was normal, and there is very little difference between the North and South in terms of white supremacy. In fact, you could sometimes, I'm not endorsing this, but in certain respects, the South might be considered less racist than the North. That's debatable, but like that slavery was wrong, but that it should be tolerated to placate the South. That the union, that the maintaining a federal government was more important than the enslavement of the African race. And I think Lincoln himself is at one point said, you know, you Southerners are very lucky. You know, you should be grateful because this is something that most Northerners think is terribly wrong, but we will support it in order to maintain goodwill with you. And you have some very famous Northern politicians who, despite their scruples, and sometimes very eloquent scruples, would defend slavery quite vociferously where it existed and in other contexts in order to placate the South and to maintain the Union. And a good example here would be someone like Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster's from New Hampshire originally, but mostly associated with Boston and Massachusetts. Strong anti-slavery guy initially, but by the time he became Secretary of State in the 1840s, this is a guy who went out of his way to do whatever was necessary to placate and help the South. He helped repatriate slaves who had been captured at sea by the British. He strenuously supported the freedom of slave laws and other legislative activities like that. And you had this sense that as bad as slavery is, disunion is worse, the union's more important. And if the South thinks that it needs us to implement a fugitive slave law or implement slavery in the territories or any number of other questions that became big issues, then it's worth doing. And it's interesting when you read, I think a good barometer of how important this was and how important it was for the federal government to support slavery is that in the lead up to the Civil War, Southerners were, in the political class at least, accusing the North of horrible, horrible aggressions. That the North is always attacking slavery and they're trying to destroy our institution and they want to destroy our society and blah, blah, blah. And this reads like, what are they talking about? There's no evidence that there was any concerted political force behind any kind of emancipation of the slaves. Yes, there certainly were abolitionists who felt that way, But they were divided. I mean, half the abolitionists thought that the North should secede from the South and what they called no union with slave power. But the abolitionists were a tiny minority that did not have political sway. Even, I mean, maybe over a handful of congressmen, but not at the highest offices of the government. There was certainly no push. One need look no further than Lincoln's first inaugural address to see, look, he's obviously not going after slavery. What's the big deal? Why are they so worried about this? If you read John C. Calhoun, who was kind of like the ideological kingpin or thinker of the antebellum Southern period, at least right before the Civil War, his career goes up until about 1850. He was writing during that time, and he was very influential, especially later in his life and then after his life. He always had people when he was alive who disagreed with him, even in the South. But they were going back and saying, well, the Northwest Ordinance in 1787 was an attack on slavery. You have them in the arguments over the territories. The suggestion that certain territories might not be allowed to have slavery absolutely made them feel like slavery was being attacked, and that any question of the efficacy of so the fugitive slave law was passed at the national level, but it was not enforced that well because so many jurisdictions in the North, especially in New England, but also elsewhere, refused to enforce the law. Mobs would release slaves, judges would refuse to, convict, and so on and so on. And the South reaction to this was highly negative, and the question is, why is that such a big deal? And the answer is because, where is the accusation that the North is attempting to end the institution coming from? Since there was no proposal to emancipate the slaves or anything like that. It's because without the subsidy, the institution is doomed to die. It is not something that can last on its own 2 feet. It's something like a central bank. If you just got rid of all government monopoly powers, all government support of a central bank, it would not last, right? If the charter is revoked, it doesn't have monopoly privilege, if it doesn't have whatever, it won't be there anymore. And the same is true with chattel slavery as it exists in the South. It wasn't good enough for the federal government to just leave it alone, which is what the most radical proponents in the North were talking about, leaving it alone. It had to be positively, actively subsidized. It had to be subsidized through the suppression in the post office. It had to be subsidized in the suppression of free blacks. That's another very important thing. If going from slavery to freedmen was total, then there was a strong incentive to become a freeman. However, if going from slave to free black meant you were still a third-class citizen and barely above slavery, then the incentive to run away from slavery is that much less. So that was very important. Now, in that regard, the North wasn't so bad, because in most of the northern states, with very few exceptions up till the Civil War, blacks weren't allowed to vote. They didn't have economic or political equality with whites, even if they weren't actually enslaved. So in that regard, they were good. But you needed to have slavery allowed to spread into the territories. There was this problem that arose in the South because we have this delicate balance after the Constitution was signed of, okay, we have these two sections, the slave section and the free section. We don't want them to become antagonistic, and we don't want them to war with each other. If we can keep the balance of power such, they won't have to. If we can keep them roughly equal, we won't have to do that. And so what developed is this idea of one slave state to one free state. And there were a whole series of compromises because slavery's ability to spread on its own was limited probably by the climate, also by the culture, right? So yes, when the deep South states entered, like Mississippi and Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas, these states, slavery had a good chance of existing without being subsidized, and indeed it did. But beyond that, once you get into the semi-arid, Midwestern states, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, farther out west, slavery is not going to exist there kind of on its own. It needs to be positively enforced. And this is exactly what people like Calhoun were saying, that while a state could restrict slavery if it wanted to, a territory, which is not a sovereign body, but somehow a creature of the federal government to one degree or another. By the way, that's a question that has not been fully answered and is kind of relevant now that Puerto Rico has just voted to become a state. Anyone who wants to read all about slavery in the territories and the role of territories, I would recommend this book, The Dred Scott Case, by Don Freyenbacher. Anyway, I won't go into that right now. It's just one of the ones that I read while I was out there. But slavery was not spreading naturally. Even in Missouri, it was kind of a mixed bag, although Missouri did become technically a slave state. It was very much a border mixed state. And this became most obvious in a state like Kansas. So Kansas at one point had it's very complicated, but they had a pro-slavery constitutional convention or pro-slavery legislature and an anti-slavery constitutional convention. What was understood at the time is that almost all the immigrants and the climate as such in Kansas meant that it was sure to be a free state. That there was no way the institution of slavery could exist there for very long. And the South was, as an organized bloc in Congress at the federal level, was doing everything it could in its power to make Kansas a free state, or a slave state, excuse me, even though they understood it would never stay that way. And what was so important about that event is that the anti-slavery forces in the North was more a sentiment. It wasn't a special interest. There wasn't a political bloc of anti-slavery Northerners. There were Whigs, there were Democrats, and while they might have feelings about slavery one or another, it wasn't their only issue, and they would be happy to side with the South, overlook slavery, and unite with the South for political advantage, right? And so you had a series of Northern Democrats who got elected president by saying, I won't challenge slavery, and that's fine with me. I mean, maybe I don't like slavery, but I'm not going to challenge it. If we can agree on the tariff or the bank or whatever else, that's fine. But the fact that you had an organized power in the South, and this didn't happen right away, by the way, it was a gradual process, this led to a reaction, right? Once that organized bloc in the South started getting compromise after compromise more or less in its favor, that's when you started having a Northern counter-reaction where people said, we don't need a Whig or a Democrat. We need somebody who is going to fight for the North and not simply allow the South to get whatever it wants. Because ultimately the South, I mean, if you look at the Dred Scott case, to give that book away, and I can't do justice to that entire case, maybe I'll do another video on it, but the finding of the Supreme Court, led by Justice Taney, who was himself a slave owner who freed all of his slaves, interestingly, and who wrote about how his slaves deserved to be free and that they had all shown themselves to be worthy of manumission, basically said that slave owners should be able to take their slaves anywhere within the country and be protected by the federal government, in which case it was completely ridiculous to speak of there being free states. And I think it was felt by him and President Buchanan at the time that the Supreme Court settling the question would be good. It actually had a very opposite reaction in the North of them saying, okay, so the South has taken over the federal government, they've taken over the presidency and the legislature, and now there's the court, and now they're trying to ram slavery down our throats and going to their representatives and saying, you need to do something about this or we'll find someone who will. But when the North refused to concede a slave Kansas, even though it was doomed to become a free Kansas no matter what, I think many in the South saw this as a bellwether that, okay, the North won't even give us the appearance of a political victory, they won't even allow us a Pyrrhic victory. We can't stay in this union anymore. So you had secessionism slowly grow, and eventually they leave. Now, they left, I think, not because slavery was about to be destroyed, but because a Lincoln presidency would probably stop to subsidize it. One of their big fears, and this is something that I think is overlooked, is that Lincoln would appoint a lot of abolitionists to political office in the South, like postmasters and stuff. He would no longer suppress free speech when it came to abolition and slavery. The post office would start to deliver anti-slavery material in the South, and this would be a problem. And that you would have federal officials in the South that Lincoln would appoint, and he would appoint, not pro-slavery people, and that they would be protected by the offices that they had by the federal government to perpetuate the ideology that slavery was wrong. Now, I don't think that Lincoln was thinking that's all I want to do, or that's something that was a big priority of his, but it's something that might have happened, and that he as president would have power to do. And this was anathema to them. Now, you do have some Southerners who are like, slavery or not, we have the right to secede, and we should secede. And I think that's based, and that even if slavery is not under threat, the fact that we're a minority within a confederation here that we can be aggressed against in any number of other ways means that it's good to secede, right? And that's something that I generally agree with. Others of them thought we're doing this specifically to keep slavery strong and to keep it forever. And Stephen Toombs' quote to that effect, that the great truth that the South is based on is the inferiority of the black man to the white man, which, by the way, would be a great truth in the North also, which is one of the reasons the South probably lost the war. Which, by the way, this is a great book for anyone interested in delving into that question, why the South lost the war. So you had people saying, yes, this whole reason is slavery, and other people saying, well, independence and secession are important principles. Now, I don't think that was a majority of people, but it did include people like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, all right? So among the most important people in the Confederacy. Well, not among the most important people in the Confederacy. Now, what's interesting is, as soon as the war starts, there were many people in the South, many Unionists and even people who weren't Unionists, who said, this war is going to lead to the end of slavery, win or lose. There's quotes from people in North Carolina and Georgia to the effect that the sure result of secession is a war, and the sure casualty of war is slavery. Abolitionism will necessarily follow because of a war. And there's another good book called What Southerners Felt About Slavery that kind of goes into this, but it became understood that either the North would free the slaves as a war measure, which is what eventually happened. And you can see, Lincoln shows us very well that he didn't immediately go and say, we're freeing the slaves, that's why we're going to war. He said repeatedly, slavery is going to continue. We just want the rebellion to end. We want to bring them back. Up until even the Emancipation Proclamation. Read that. It's very short. He says, if you come back to the Union, anyone who comes back loyally will get to keep their slaves. This is only emancipating the slaves of those who continue to rebel. But the war gave many slaves the opportunity to escape, which many of them did, and many of them joined the Union, and then the North started mobilizing them into military units by 1863. And one of the tenets of the ideology of slavery is that, especially, and this isn't all slavery, but chattel slavery in the United States, race-based slavery, as it existed, was that this is an inferior race. They're not suited to be citizens. They're not suited to be free. They're not suited to perform the tasks that white people are. One of the tenets of that was that they couldn't be soldiers, that slaves were too servile, that they were, which is, I mean, being servile is a good thing for a soldier, I would think, but not in the mind of Southerners at the time, that they were too cowardly, that they were too stupid, whatever else. And when the North started mobilizing black units, we can argue about how they weren't like especially effective or anything like that, but they were militarily effective. They were good enough soldiers that they could be used in battle, even though there was tremendous racism against them anyway. Now, late in the war, you had some Southerners, by 1863 and 1864 especially, start talking about maybe we should arm the slaves. There was these ongoing manpower shortages in the military in the South. And yet they have 4 million slaves and probably anywhere from 200,000 to 400,000 military-worthy blacks in the South that are just not being touched. And there's a fascinating document by an Irish general in the South named Patrick Cockburn, basically arguing that if we don't utilize them in our military, we're going to lose the war. And if we do utilize them, well, we'll win the war potentially, and then we might be able to retain slavery, or we might have to emancipate, but we'll be independent. And there were people, and Jefferson Davis counts among them, as does Robert E. Lee, people who said, if we can get our independence from manumitting the slaves and giving them their freedom, then we should do it, and it's worth it. You had many other people, especially in the political class, who said, well, if we have to free the slaves to win the war, then we should never have gone to war in the first place. We could have kept the slaves and not gone to war. And this is probably, and to give away the main thesis of that book, by the way, which is a good book, this one again, Why the South Lost the Civil War, was if it suddenly becomes apparent that slavery is over, because the South itself is manumitting, is freeing them, right? There was a lot of debate about could we use the slaves militarily and not free them? And there were some people who suggested, yeah, we'll have them risk their lives and fight, and then we can promise them, like 1 day off a week, and maybe increased rations, on Christmas or whatever. And it was interesting because the reaction was, obviously that would be insufficient motivation on their part, and there's a creeping understanding when in these debates that they have volition, that they have the same incentives that you or I or anyone else would have, that they need that in order to have them behave in the way that you'd like, you'd have to treat them that way. And this makes slavery ideologically unsupportable in the terms that they had. That's probably that book is probably worth going into more, because there were other reasons, but like as soon as the South started actually having black soldiers, which it did in 1865, too close towards the end for it to be accounted for by most people's opinion about the causes of the defeat. But this was so important. Why are we fighting if the whole point was that slavery is right and blacks are inferior, and now we're gonna free them and have them fight in the army and basically admit, oh, they're good soldiers, in which case slavery is wrong, and then we're all guilty. Now this kind of fed in at the end of the war, because these people were evangelical Christians, and because they believed that there was a literal God who took active role in the world. Many of them believed that the many defeats that the South had had up to that point, which, by the way, as dramatic as they may have been, were not crippling the South's ability to fight. Were not conquering the entire South. They were major and you could even say maybe catastrophic, but not literally lethal to the entire political institution of the South. But that these were chastisements from God for something. And some of them put forth other ideas, but you've had 30 years of abolitionists telling you that you're going to hell and you're in violation of God's law because of slavery. You have a doubt in your head that that might be true, and then you have a military defeat like Gettysburg or Vicksburg or the burning of Atlanta or something like that, and it starts to come home, and then you start to admit, well, maybe we should make them soldiers because we need them to win the war. Ergo, slavery is wrong. Ergo, all these bad things are the punishment of God. He's chastising us for our and then it becomes, why are we fighting? We should just stop. And that's exactly what happened. One thing about that book, again, Why the South Lost the Civil War, is that it makes it very clear that the South could have continued fighting. That the resources of the North, although they were much greater than the South, given the technology of the day, were not enough to occupy the entire South, or even enough of the South to cripple it from resisting further. That they always had, I mean, even until the end, they could have maintained armies and continued fighting, and they just didn't. They just gave up. They were like, what? We were wrong, and they weren't. But this is the big conflation that I think this video should be about. They were wrong about slavery. They were not wrong about secession. Secession has never been proven in the court of law. It's never been discredited, at least ideologically or in any principle. Yes, the South was wrong about slavery. They weren't wrong about secession. They weren't wrong about a whole host of other things. One of the reasons that it was so easy to come back is that they still were racist, but the North was racist. That wasn't a bone of, that was not an area of contention. It was even rare among abolitionists for people to be true egalitarians when it came to the races. There were some, but very few. And the big one issue was slavery. Whether it was, and even there, it was a question of, is the federal government going to support it or not? Because it's necessary. This whole institution was entirely dependent on its profitable functioning, active support. And that's another reason why it ended. As soon as the war started, the North stopped subsidizing slavery. It no longer supported it. And halfway through the war, it started actively working against it, although the war itself would have eroded it considerably. So, and that's something that people don't understand, I don't think. They don't understand the degree to which Southerners themselves started basically coming around to the idea of emancipation, and that they understood how absolutely important. There's quotes in this why the South lost the war. When people saying the federal government is the greatest shield of slavery ever. That's what protects slavery. That's what makes slavery possible. And if we leave that protection, if we secede, then the institution is doomed. And that proved to be prescient. That proved to be what happened. So it's not a case of something being eradicated by the federal government so much as the federal government supported it and then it stopped supporting it, and without its support it went away, in a nutshell. So obviously it's a very complex issue, and I feel kind of weird even trying to sum it up in a video that's in 41 minutes. And I'm not trying to sum it up. I'm just trying to bring across a few points. And it's a shame that people just don't understand that it's been simplified to an abolitionist crusade by an egalitarian North against a demonic South, and that's just the complete injustice about what happened. And it's a failure to they're exonerating the federal government in a way that's completely ridiculous. They're giving it much more credit than it's due. Right? It's negating the role of blacks themselves for running away. In the real Lincoln, or not real Lincoln, what is it? Abraham Lincoln's White Dream. He talks about how, which is another book that I think I reviewed earlier. It talks about just the slaves running away was crippling the institution. Once the war started, it became much easier for them to escape, and many did. And let's say that Lincoln was assassinated before the South had largely surrendered, and that Andrew Johnson had ended the war. It's very unlikely that slavery would have lasted in the existing South for very long, if even a year or two, given the shock that it had taken over the course of the war. So anyway, just an interesting video. I'll try and upload a few more before I leave. I have to leave in just a couple days. Highly unlikely that I'll be able to record anything or talk about anything before then. I do have a few other ideas though that I can do before I go. So hello everyone again. Good talking to you all, and I will see you all later.